Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Eve Stern, Director of the Center for the Humanities, and this is the second event in our spring brown bag series. I'm really delighted to have English professor David Faflik presenting today. But first, I'd like to introduce his colleague, Kyle Koos, who teaches English and Gender and Women's Studies and is an expert in the cultural study of sport. And Kyle will introduce David.
Right, thanks, Steve. Well, I'm honored to have David invite me here to introduce him for this brown bag talk. I was thinking about when I first met David. I met David about 10 years ago. I don't know if he remembers this, but he was leading a charge to reinvigorate the American Studies curriculum here at URI. And I was at the time working in the kinesiology department, and I showed up to the meeting, and afterwards David approached me and asked, what is someone from kinesiology doing here at this American Studies discussion? So that was the moment we first met and got to talking. And that's the moment I think we both learned that we were interested in sport culture, and particularly the ways in which sport cultures can be important sites of racial politics. Since then, David and I have become fast friends, mostly through our shared love of the beautiful game, which we'll be talking about, I think, in part today. And through our interactions, I've come to know David as one of the most humble, supportive, and generous colleagues I've met here at URI. And although he'd be the last to tell you this, David's a very incredibly accomplished scholar. He's written 4 books, single-authored and edited another. 3 of those single-authored books he's written since 2018, which is mind-boggling, really. Incredibly, he's also working on another 3 books that are in progress, one of which I'm looking forward to reading, that's focused on a cultural history of the racial integration of what he calls Red Sox Nation. David's also authored 24 book chapters and journal articles throughout his career on a wide range of topics, from transcendentalism to Melville, to representations of the city and literature, to American studies methodologies, and to the racial rhetoric around football espoused by such luminaries as Nelson Mandela, Barack Obama, and Martin Luther King Jr. In 2022, he earned a Fulbright Distinguished Chair Award to travel to Brazil. His time there culminated in a book provisionally titled Plus Minas, Profiles in Brazil's Beautiful Game, which is currently under review at Temple University Press. And if I'm not mistaken, today's talk will be the first time that David's actually shared anything about this project with the world. So we're all kind of lucky to be here today. So please join me in welcoming David to the podium to share his work with us today.
Thank you, Kyle, for those kind words, and thank you to Eve, and of course, thank you to the Center for Humanities for hosting this talk today. I'm going to talk today about a sport that the rest of the world calls football, or soccer, as it's known in the United States. To put things in their proper context, my subject is the cultural phenomenon the Brazilians have named Jogo Bonito, and please indulge my attempt to speak Portuguese today, meaning the beautiful game. As a long-distance observer of the sport since I was a teenager, I was recently afforded a more personal vantage on futebol, to use the correct Portuguese term, during my 4 months residence in Brazil as a Fulbright scholar from May to September 2022. My base of operations in Brazil was the city of Belo Horizonte in Minas Gerais state, where I taught both an undergraduate and graduate course at the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. And the research project that I undertook during my stay focused on the local professional football side, Clube Atlético Mineiro, or simply Atlético, as the team is colloquially known among fans of the country's top domestic football league, the Brasileirão. And that's the club crest there I'm showing. All of which probably begs any number of questions, among them why? Why football? Why Brazil? Why Atlético Mineiro? And why now? By way of response, I might explain that the origins of the book that I've written about Atlético, titled Plus Minus, as Kyle said, Profiles in Brazil's Beautiful Game, trace in the most immediate sense to the spring of 2020, when I was awarded a Fulbright amid the initial dislocations of the COVID-19 pandemic. Like many people, I felt a special need at that time for something life-affirming. shaken as I was by the mounting casualties associated with this most recent in a spate of novel coronaviruses to afflict populations across the globe. And again, like others, I found that affirmation in my steadfast dedication to the planet's most celebrated spectator sport. Professional football was, of course, among the earliest games that contemporaries play to resume organized and, no less important, televised competition in the late spring of 2020. Those of us with an emotional stake in the game will remember this as a time when leagues across Europe, Asia, and North and South America began to allow players to return to the pitch, with or without supporters in the stands. Never mind that the public health authorities were urging the necessity of social distancing as a means of slowing the virus's harmful spread. Traveling as I was, or eventually would be, after the start of my Fulbright was postponed until the latter half of 2022, I was ready to embrace the opportunity my trip afforded me for thinking about why so many fans of the sport should regard football as at once something to live for and also something to potentially die for. In my own case, thousands of miles from the place I call home. It bears emphasizing that the interrelated vagaries of life, love, and sport have never been the exclusive preserve of such storied capitals of world football as Brazil's two largest cities, Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. Both the fervor and the fear attending football's version of the collective return to normalcy under the coronavirus have in fact been felt throughout each of Brazil's 26 states, including the state of Minas Gerais. Occupying a landmass larger than France in Brazil's southeast and interior, Minas Gerais might lack the postcard appeal of the country's heralded beaches, just as Brazilians' habit of associating the state with an idealized rural simplicity has denied it a certain cosmopolitan sophistication in the popular imagination. But Mineiros, as those who are born and raised in Minas Gerais are known, reside in an area that Brazilians by and large regard with a special affection, reserved for what many of them identify as the country's heartland. Not a few of the original settlers in the area from the 17th and 18th centuries are remembered today as a salt of the earth assemblage of miners, farmers, ranchers, laborers, and merchants. Mineiros are furthermore a diverse people, representative of the demographic complexity that not only characterizes modern-day Brazil, but also reappears symbolically in the signature vertical black and white stripes of Atletico's team jerseys. Mineiros are the descendants, that is, of the former slaves, free blacks, colonial Portuguese, and indigenous groups who together have lent Brazil a richly variegated ethnic and cultural heritage. Part of the purpose of my book has been to examine that heritage from the perspective of sport, using one state's provincial footballing tradition as the occasion to reconsider what allows life to persist in the face of, well, life. Whether Mineiros' enthrallment to football should be included among what ethnographers and anthropologists would describe as the region's general defining features is a subject that lies beyond the scope of my study. What I do try to address is how the human determination to play, including with language, as the pun from my plus-minus title suggests, finds expression through sport, even when what's happening in the world around us defies logic. I've organized my study as a series of selective profile of the players, and by that term I mean football observers and supporters too, who have recently plied their trades with or in the emotional vicinity of Clube Atlético Mineiro. As a rule, these profiles are always rhetorical, in the sense that my book argues that we can't begin to take the full measure of football until we take seriously the feelings of its participants. Dutch social theorist Johan Huizinga, writing before the Second World War, concluded that modern sport was already, and these are his words, stiffening into seriousness, but still being felt as play, end quote. I've tried to resist a similar slide into a rigidity best described as unfun. First, by grounding my revisionist examination of sport at the grassroots, as it were, the better to avoid reducing Brazilians' feelings about football to a pervasive cultural condition. Second, by making a conscientious effort to balance the scholar's imperative to intellectualize with the instincts of players and fans to personalize the games we play. My overriding interest then has been in providing a playfully meditative, chronicle-style account of the emotions that football inspires among a given people in a specific place at a particular time. Here, the focus is with the players and supporters of the Belo Horizonte side Atlético Mineiro. I hesitate to offer a grand theory of Latin American affect. What I have written is what I like to call a microhistory of the emotions, the better to address how play feels at a cultural moment that has clearly been fraught with a whole range of feelings. What I likewise need to stress is that I did not choose Atletico as a topic for consideration because of any special sporting prowess it might possess. The team does enjoy a regional pride of place in Minas Gerais state, with deference to supporters of rival club sides Cruzeiro and the newly promoted America. Its 47 Campeonato Mineiro titles is a record that no other regional side could match. And yet, until these past few years, Atletico, by comparison, had not amassed much hardware outside of its home state since the Brasileirão launched the nationwide football competition in 1971. The team coincidentally claimed this inaugural competition, but only by the end of the Brasileirão's 2021 season, 50 years after the first, would Atletico once more finish atop the league standings, having placed as runners-up on 5 previous occasions. One could say that COVID-19 has been kind to Atlético Mineiro in this respect. It won the 2021 editions of the Campeonato Mineiro, the state football competition, and the Copa do Brasil too, completing a domestic treble under the since departed, professionally speaking that is, and later reinstalled manager Cuca, even while the Brazilian casualties from COVID-19 mounted. Atletico, in short, is surely respectable enough in sporting terms to justify the extended treatment that I give it. Witness the clubs claiming respective and successive intercontinental triumphs in the 2013 and 2014 editions of the Copa Libertadores and Recopa Sudamericana. At the same time, Atletico historically has failed to contend for league honors with the same consistency as bigger city sides like Flamengo, São Paulo, Corinthians, Santos, and Palmeiras, all of which brings us back to the COVID-19 wrecked season of 2020. Originally scheduled from May 3rd to December 6th on the calendar, this same installment of the Brasileirão was modified because of COVID-19 to run from August 8th, 2020 to February 25th, 2021. If Atletico did not prevail during this fateful season, which is now remembered as much for its endless complications regarding scheduling dilemmas and the maintenance of COVID protocols as it is for any joie de vivre that games might have produced on match days, Club Atlético Mineiro did give the competition's more fashionable sides a real run for their money. If this characterization of Brazil's sporting culture sounds uplifting, it is so only to the extent that it recognizes that our players were not untouched by the very real hardships and uncertainties the people of their country have experienced before and during COVID times. Brazilians have long been beset by any number of infectious diseases, whether borne by man or mosquito. There was even a precedent for those diseases having had an adverse effect on football, as when host city Rio de Janeiro was compelled to postpone the South American Championships of Nations, or Sul-Americana, from 1918 to 1919 due to the worldwide influenza epidemic that coincided with the closing stages of the First World War. In addition, systemic racism is endemic to Brazil as it is the United States. Poverty and crime are similarly widespread there, and environmental depredation is ongoing as it is everywhere on Earth. Their obvious privileges notwithstanding, Atletico's players have pursued their sport amid conditions that well might make a mockery of Brazil's national motto, Ordem e Progresso, a cognate phrase that translates as order and progress. Yet precisely because of these seeming paradoxes, and irrespective of the growing justification we might have for suspending all our games, the Atleticanos whose lives I've chronicled embody a persevering spirit to play that warrants further scrutiny. Such is the purpose of my book. In staking its claim to this more subjective side of sport, above and beyond its overt political significance, my project advances a series of implicit propositions that will hopefully expand the bases on which football can be construed as fit for the consideration of non-participants in the game, not because, but despite its unquestioned political associations. Methodologically, Plus Minus posits that play can retain a humanist interest for students of culture without having to be subordinated to an analysis of the social dynamics of power. Intellectually, it contends that the impulse to examine the root feelings that inform sport need not be dismissed as innocent or naive, even when this impulse relegates political consciousness as a topic to a position of secondary importance. As the German cultural theorist Hans Ulrich Gumbricht explains, there is a physical, material, and aesthetic pleasure to all variety of athletic performances that derives from the distance, that's Gumbricht's term, that separates sport from the interests and strategies that make up our everyday world. The joy that we experience when we indulge this pleasure is enough of a philosophical justification to appreciate football as a way of being in the world that need not qualify as escapist. And finally, Plus Minus serves as a timely reminder that we don't have to be world-class athletes to think of ourselves as players. We're all in the game simply by virtue of being here, by being alive in the web of relations and emotions that sport ideally forges, not least in times of crisis. We'll turn to the page now. Composed by the Minas Gerais native Vicente Mota in 1969, the opening lines of Atletico's anthem proclaim the club's resilience and ever readiness to rise to any challenge. I'm quoting here. "We are from Club Atlético Mineiro," the lyric begins. "We play with a lot of raça and amor. We vibrate with joy in victories," end quoting. In COVID-19, of course, Atletico had met an altogether different variety of opponent, meaning the team would need to confront the virus with more than the raça and amor, the former Portuguese word connoting inner strength and grit, the latter denoting love, it celebrates in song. It is in fact on raça that I want to focus the remainder of my talk, the better to demonstrate the wide-ranging implications that our feelings for football carry in both the best and worst of times. Crucially, countless Brazilians have played the game with a freedom and joy, or alegria, that some observers would liken to a national birthright. But suggest that this quality of play is indicative of a distinctive Brasilidade, or essentialized Brazilianness, that distinguishes native footballers from the Europeans who are said to have founded the sport upon rationalized principles of instrumental endeavor, is to subscribe to the racialized understanding of the game that Brazilians themselves have struggled with over the last century. To be clear, I am by no means suggesting that Brazilian footballers, and by implication, the many Afro-Brazilian common folk, or povo, who populate their ranks, are innately playful, unreasoning, or childlike in their reputed primitiveness, at least not any more so than men and women raised in colder climes. No player's will to play should be mistaken for a racial trait, an ethnic heritage, or a national signifier. With that said, most of the Atleticanos who I've talked to insist that the club's distinguishing emotional trait is indeed raça, which is also the Portuguese word for race. To an outsider such as myself, at least, it seems only natural to wonder whether Club Atlético Mineiro, which was also the first professional football side in Brazil to regularly field Black players, might boast the most raça precisely because it has historically been the most racially integrated team in the Brasileirão. This is but the first of the complications attending raça. The Brazilian author and Atletico supporter, Ricardo de Lupo, takes to heart the logic of Atletico's complex emotional being, premised as it is on equal parts raça and amor. Lupo finds nothing contradictory about Atletico's twin preparedness to love and to fight, to compete and to play. Since its foundation, he explains, and I'm quoting here, Club Atlético Mineiro has been a defender of good causes, Lupo says, without allowing its convictions to harden into prejudices and without permitting its most forcefully felt feelings to inhibit the greater good that is fair play. Football is not war, Lupo says again. Is peace and joy. With all the assurances of an initiate, At the same time, Galupo likens Hassa and Amor, and I'm quoting once more, to a black and white microbe that gets into people's blood and doesn't come out at all, end quote. He, in other words, operates on the emotional assumption that his love for the club is something that exists under the skin, or to borrow the name of the subscription-based Atletico benefits card, Galo Navaya, a 21st century supporter of Atletico only begins to qualify as such once the passion that he feels for his side has gotten into the veins, not unlike a virus. It would be difficult to diagnose an affliction that doubles as an affection. Not only that, we have no reliable basis for even knowing with any certainty whether players want to be infected. The Atletico players whom Galupo portrays in his history of Atletico betray enough of the symptoms of sentiment to suggest that they are very much moved by emotions, but their feelings about football don't necessarily reduce to Hassa y Amor. There is, to begin, the feeling of socially conscious righteousness that players and supporters alike have nurtured from the club's beginning. Founded in 1908 by a group of 22 upper-class secondary school students, civil servants, and working professionals in Belo Horizonte, Atletico Mineiro Football Club, as Atletico was then known, began as an amateur institution, as did all football clubs in those days, with a difference. Rather than being tied to any particular social group or ethnic enclave, the modest young men who established themselves as a, quote, people's club decided early on that they would not discriminate according to race, class, religion, or nationality. All were welcome at Atletico, and the team in consequence attracted the largest fan base in the surrounding city and state. Our founding Mineiros could also play against the backdrop of the tree-lined streets and unpaved roads of their native Belo Horizonte. They won the inaugural installment of the Campeonato Mineiro in 1915 before repeating as champions in 1925. As this was unpaid labor, the players who helped secure these titles sweated for fun during the Sunday afternoon kickabouts that marked, in retrospect, a transitional period for the sport in Brazil. For when Atletico Mineiro reconstituted itself as a professional sports organization in 1933, the club's cherished principle of equal access thereafter had to coexist with its not entirely welcome practice of pay for play. Other clubs in the city raised strenuous objections at Atletico, ironically, if temporarily, ceded the populist moral high ground to its neighbors. Not only that, but some of the emotions manifested by the club's players on the field of play are purely ugly. To apply to football, Sean Nye's formulation of those negative feelings within our culture, and these would include envy, anxiety, and irritation, among others, that we struggle to reconcile with our more exalted sense of ourselves. If Hassa y Amor represent Atletico at its aspirational best, then there is a substratum of feelings on which the club draws to play a game which, like the world it pretends, is anything but Atletico black and white. Thus, maybe it was rage and not just an excess of Hassa that induced Kafunga, the goalkeeper who represented Atletico from 1935 to 1955, to impose himself physically on his teammates during training sessions, to the point that the team's strikers, who otherwise lined up on the same side of the field as him on match days, knew better than ever to try to put the ball past their own shot stopper. Then there was the club's all-time leading goal scorer and consensus best player, Reinaldo, who netted 255 times for Atletico at an average rate of 1.55 goals per match in the 1977 season, still the highest in league history. Over the course of his 475 appearances for the club between 1973 and 1985. Atletico supporters adore Ohe, as they punningly named him. Opposing players brutalized the king, bringing a halt to his jinking runs with fouls that were so insistent they left Reinaldo in need of no less than 9 surgeries, many of them on his much harried knees, by the time he was 21. If there was a dark side of the Brazilian game, then Reinaldo experienced it more than most. But aside from his political sentiments, the king openly opposed the military dictatorship that seized control of the country in 1964, and so took to celebrating his goals with a raised fist of defiance toward the regime. a player whom the national opposition newspaper Movimento metonymically named or described as bom de bola, bom de cuca, good on the ball, right in the head, felt a greater weight of responsibility to his club than he did resentment against competitors. It is true that the seriousness with which Reinaldo took to his trade did nothing to dampen his playfulness on the pitch. Quoting, "I don't worry about the opponent, only the ball," he said. But from the start of his playing at Atletico, Ojé recognized that his performances were ultimately undertaken in the service of something or someone larger than himself. In conversation with Reinaldo during my time in Belo Horizonte, I had the chance to ask him whether that something had anything to do with race. Ojé demurred by way of a reply, yet I continue to suspect that raça may ultimately be a sign of blackness more than it is a regional indicator of pluck. For of all the factors that have defined the contours of Brazilian life from the colonial period forward, perhaps none exceeds the influence of race in determining a person's place in both the sporting and social orders. Indeed, in assessing the condition of the black diaspora in the early 1950s, the French West Indian political philosopher, Frantz Fanon would write, quoting, "However painful it may be for me to accept this conclusion, I am obliged to state it. For the black man, there was only one destiny, and it is white," end quote. As Fanon saw it, the black man was compelled to perform whiteness in a white man's world. Race, to that end, denied a black man the possibility of determining the trajectory of his life on his own terms. The legacy of Brazil's vexed racial history does not need to be recounted here to prove or disprove Fanon's thesis. As the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, which it belatedly did in 1888, Brazil has long grappled with the sensitive questions of race and belonging in a society for which the label multi-ethnic barely suffices. Not only has futebol been implicated in Brazilians' ongoing discussions about the role that race plays in describing the arc of its citizens' lives, it has arguably been the foundation upon which the superstructure of its modern society has been built in response to the prevailing fact that is football. Etymologically speaking, raça and raça share a linguistic lineage that belies the semantic divergence the two terms have taken in Brazilians' everyday speech. Among the players for Atletico with whom I spoke, none was prepared to draw a meaningful line of connection between the congruence of two words, which, from the perspective of someone who was perhaps too eager, meaning myself, to draw conclusions from idiomatic coincidence, might help explain an emotion that few would deny, but no one could define. Yet there would appear to be more than circumstantial evidence linking race and raça. In the landmark article, Football Mulatto, that's the title, that he wrote in 1938 for the newspaper Diários Associados, Brazilian social scientist Gilberto Freire was proposed what was to become a sustaining myth of the country's favorite sport, and by extension, its national identity, well into the 20th century. Comparing the unstudied artistry of Brazil's mixed-race players, were only then beginning to gain a more conspicuous presence in the domestic game, with the comparative predictableness and, quote, geometrical rationalism of Europe's white footballers. Freire conflated what he saw as the racialized traits of mulattoes, and again, that's his term, with the free-flowing form of futebol that they played when given the opportunity, as they were in the two matches against French sides Strasbourg and Bordeaux that precipitated Freire's commentary. Freire characterizes what he calls mulachismo as a set of inborn qualities best expressed by a person who's, quoting, agile in assimilating, dominating, light-footed in dance, end quote. As for the football that persons of mixed ethnicity and a range of darker skin tones played, this Freire would have us believe is full of, quote, surprise, guile, cunning, lightness, at the same time, individual spontaneity, end quote. What Freire was suggesting was that people of certain racial characteristics were given to playing the game a certain way, or rather more moderately, Freire was preparing to use the racial illogic of his hypothesis as the basis for a far more sweeping claim. Psychologically, he declared, and I'm quoting once more, "Being a Brazilian is being mulatto," end quote. By such grandiose standards, the related proposition, which I by no means endorse, that Black players might play the game with more raça than others seems modest, but it too finally amounts to little more than racial stereotyping. This remains the case, even though more and more Brazilian clubs began to enlist Black players into their squads during a period of post-de facto segregation in the 1930s and 1940s, such that the storied sports journalist Mario Filho could write in his still-read post-war book, O Negro no Futebol Brasileiro, that we are living in what he names A Vez do Preto, the time of Blacks. Filho's pronouncement at best describes an aspirational racial dynamic, for at the turn of the 20th century, many of the country's most privileged whites promulgated an idea of whitening Brazilian society, such that the nation's African and indigenous bloodlines would be diffused through a process of miscegenation that eventually remade the nation according to what was perceived to be a, quote, European pattern of shared identity. This was not a gesture of noblesse oblige by whites. It was rather an attempt carried out by the self-regarding members of a racial minority to remake Black folk and mestizos in their own image. When white elites acknowledged peoples of color at all, they tended to look upon them as undisciplined and improvidently free-spirited, forever waiting for diversion, but never ready to work. What in fact followed over the course of the next several decades in Brazil was a period of intensified nationalism and anti-monarchical complaint. And the cultural environment that emerged in these years ironically grew more and more receptive than before to the nation's pedestrian expressions of Blackness, which were now seen as what two recent observers call a, quote, Ludic means of reconciling racial difference and unifying a fully modernized Brazil through play. Freire's mulatismo enjoyed enhanced favor in these years, as the domestic popularity of samba, carnaval, and futebol soared. This is not to suggest that an easy racial harmony ensued. There were noticeable setbacks, to be sure, most memorably when, in 1950, a vocal contingent of the press and public sought to attribute Brazil's humiliating home loss to Uruguay in the World Cup, which, as those of you who know, is the most coveted prize in world football for qualifying national teams, to the underperformance of three Black players, one of whom, left back João Ferreira, was a native of Belo Horizonte and had begun his club career playing with Atlético Mineiro from 1940 to 1943. Brazil's run of World Cup successes in 1958, 1962, and 1970 would somewhat ease racial tensions in the country, thanks in no small part to the vital contributions of Black players such as Pelé, a Minas Gerais native, it should be said, and Garrincha, who was part Black and part Funio Indian. Well into the current century, however, Brazil has continued to parse the meaning of play by attending to the racial overtones of its preferred sport. Witness the remarks made by the Afro-Brazilian philosopher, writer, and activist Sueli Carneiro when she complained during a televised interview with rapper Mano Brown in May 2022 that Black players were purposely being excluded from the game. Carneiro was speaking on this occasion to what she called, quote, the whitening of Brazilian football, end quote, a retrograde development that she tied directly to the discriminatory practices that she alleges have been denying Blacks access to the game at all levels, from recreational to professional. Writing about the perilous yet potentially liberating relation between society and sport in the United States under COVID-19, Grant Fairwood captured the racial tenor of Carneiro's concerns in the title of his 2022 book, Only a Black Athlete Can Save Us Now. Carneiro might second Fairwood's emotions if only there were, by her count, any Black footballers still playing in Brazil. That any futebol club, Atlético included, should lay claim to raça as something worth wanting within the context of Brazil's conflicted racial history might seem surprising, but there are reasons why they would do so. From at least the 1930s, sports columnists in Brazil have been using the most positive connotations of the term raça for patriotic purposes, as when the country's oldest daily sports newspaper, the Rio de Janeiro-based Jornal dos Sports, hailed the strength of the, quote, privileged race of strongmen, end quote, who claimed the South American rowing championships for their country in March 1931. Raça, in this instance, has not only been applied to a sport other than football, it is meant to denominate a race of Brazilians in emphatically nationalist rather than narrowly ethnic terms. Then again, rowing, not football, was the most popular sport in Rio de Janeiro at the turn of the century. And although several sports associations in this city, most notably Clube de Regatas do Flamengo, would eventually combine rowing with football as the appeal of the latter sport grew, their constituents remained predominantly white. As a key to Raça's range of contemporary usage in any case, Jornal dos Sports' lexical register was far more accommodating than the admissions policies of Rio's regatta clubs. To begin, the paper applied the label Raça liberally, but not too liberally, to athletes from a range of sports, including football, boxing, and even cricket. One looks in vain in these early years, however, for a black footballer or a black athlete of any kind, really, being described as raçudo, meaning that he was regarded by commentators as having Raça. Yet there are instances of white French boxers having Raça, and there are references as well to both a Raça Latina and a Raça Negra. Thus, even a cursory examination of the then current racial discourse in Brazil during the first half of the 20th century would suggest that the sports inflections of Raça were either a desirable thing or a relatively neutral thing, but probably not a black thing. That would begin to change in much the same way that mulachismo evolved in Brazil from carrying a stigma of racial inferiority to be an exciting signifier of ethnic raciness. If Raça was once the exclusive preserve of whites, it soon came to apply to an increasing number of black athletes, as their performances before an admiring sports public earned them the respect that was their due. The consensual understanding of Raça accordingly expanded just enough to quietly admit black footballers because of their ability to play. Sometime Brazilian midfielder Didi, for example, retired by this stage in his illustrious career, but back home in Rio de Janeiro to celebrate Carnival, made a cameo appearance in the pages of Jornal dos Sports in January 1968 with the Raça of a Sambista. Another class act in these years was the entire Rio de Janeiro side Vasco da Gama, with a multiracial squad that the journal praised for using Raça to impose its technical superiority on opponents that resorted to a violent style of play to offset their deficiencies. But as we have seen, there are many shades to the feelings Raça contains, so it was quite feasible that teams depending on violencia and other negative tactics might themselves be recognized for fielding players with raçudo, whatever was their race. Indeed, Raça had been loosened up enough by the late 1960s that the traditional racial profiles of black and white players might be reversed. This is exactly what happened when the Journal ran a feature article in April 1968 describing the impact that Vasco's white midfielder Adilson had on his team's Raça. By contrast, the paper called it, quoting, an irony of destiny that Mario, a darker-skinned and embittered player, that's the paper's phrase, for Vasco's most recent vanquished opponent, Bangu, should show great, quote, tranquility of temperament, end quote, in a loss that he called one of the most unfair I've started in my career. Raça might not have become the sole possession of black athletes, but it was no longer monopolized by whites either. We might say that blackness by this time represented a far greater range of emotions in Brazil than it ever had before, whether it signified the bitterness of defeat or the unrelenting bite of Raça, the buoyancy of spontaneity or the tranquility of the professional athlete who'd seen it all before. Black ceased to be the most reductive of racial signs in a country that had long made race a convenient shorthand for the perpetuation of all manner of prejudice. Black even made claims to being beautiful in Brazil by the 1970s. As a social movement, Black is Beautiful had, of course, emerged in the United States during the previous decade under the leadership of a Pan-Africanist cohort of activist African Americans. And with the international spread of the movement's message, a small group of like-minded residents in Rio de Janeiro would be advocating locally for a short-lived equivalent of Black is Beautiful by August 1976, when a photo shoot appearing in the prominent Rio de Janeiro journal, Do Brasil, sparked controversy with its images of Black men sporting afros and platform shoes. Not everyone in the country was offended by what critics cited as evidence of, quote, un-Brazilian behavior. In fact, Jornal dos Sports had anticipated Brazil's fleeting Black is Beautiful movement 5 years earlier when it published interviews with 4 of domestic football's Black craques, and again, forgive me for my pronunciation, or star players, under the attention-grabbing headline, Negros podem ser blancos, meaning Blacks can be whites. The premise for the piece was the growing fad for the elective procedure by which Black clients in the United States and abroad were paying to have their skin whitened. Asked by journalist Marilena Dabus, the first woman to cover football in Brazil, how they felt about these procedures, the assembled cast of standout footballers voiced an unmistakable pride in their race, acknowledging that racismo existe no Brasil. Paulo Cesar, or Caju, as he was commonly known, remarked, quoting, "It is difficult for a Negro to sell in his profession," end quote. Right-winger Jairzinho was concerned less with immediate questions of work than the larger existential implications of what he effectively likened to an act of self-negation, saying, quoting, "If they," meaning those who underwent skin whitening, "change color, it is because they are ashamed of being Black. I find this absurd," end quote. Goalkeeper Ubi Ahara framed the problem in economic terms, pointing out that if a wealthy, quote, Creole were a Black, Brazilians at worst were prepared to look upon him as what he called, quote, navy blue, end quote. And as for the Minas Gerais native Fio Maravilha, the very gesture of a Black person lightening his skin color no longer made sense, he said, quoting, "Now that race has morals," end quote. Fio's contention might well stand for those of the rest of the journal's interviewees. By July 1971, when the paper conducted these conversations, and some 5 months before Clube Atlético Mineiro secured the title of Brazil's newly formed Brasileirão, the best Black players in the country were ready to lay claim to more raça, not less, in every sense of the word. Clube Atlético Mineiro confronted these questions alongside other teams in the new league, but with a critical difference. With his full-fledged Atlético debut in 1973, Atlético's legendary striker, Reinaldo, made raça an unavoidable topic of conversation in a nation that tends to regard those who broach issues of race as agitators. Historian Roger Kittleson calls Reinaldo, quoting, "another rebellious crack," end quote, and with good reason. The upraised fist Reinaldo used to celebrate his goals during the latter part of the decade paid obvious tribute to 2 African-American athletes, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who earlier shocked the world with the Black Power salute they used in receiving their track and field medals at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. Reinaldo's young age, he was a mere teenager when he became a first-team regular with Atlético, and boyish, photogenic appearance might have taken a bit of the edge off the player's politics, but the goal scorer whom the Brazilian press had begun to call baby crack pulled no punches when he asserted himself on and off the field. Felipe Lima, Reinaldo's son and biographer, dwells on what he describes as the, quote, coolness and tranquility, end quote, with which his father finished scoring opportunities when he played. For all these feelings he inspired in his supporters, O'Hay was always in control of his own emotions. And this was the case despite the relentless pressure he faced as defenders corralled, kicked, and pushed Atletico's ace up and down the length of the pitch, since they could find no other way to contain him. Felipe Lima writes that Reinaldo, to this extent, quoting, embodied the spirit of the team, end quote, a claim with which even non-Atleticanos were inclined to agree when they considered the player's larger body of work. An editorial appearing in Jornal dos Sports in April 1977, for example, spoke at once to the common sense, lucidity, and good deportment, end quote, with which the rebel Reinaldo played. Without ever using the word raça to characterize the performances of the player, the author of these remarks perhaps paid Reinaldo the highest compliment of all when he honored him for the, quote, certain didactic force, end quote, in his style of play. Reinaldo had not only helped to make Hassa righteous, he carried himself in such a way that his manner of playing became instructive for those who were fortunate enough to watch. The club may have since recovered from the enormities of COVID-19, but that is not to say the team can overcome its complicated racial history, or that it would want to necessarily. For example, the renowned newspaper cartoonist Manga Bera is said to have based his iconic animal embodiment of the club on a black and white species of rooster, Galo garijo, that was known in Belo Horizonte in the early part of the 20th century as a fiercely competitive gamecock in the cockfights that many mixed-race spectators patronized as they partook of the city's vernacular entertainments. And that's the better known of the club's sort of universal icons. Then too, the martial airs of the club's original anthem from 1928 likewise gave way to the racially encoded rhythmic swing of Mota's samba-influenced hymn from 1969. Whether or not Atletico's fans realized it, there was something racial in the main song they sing during matches to help players dar Hassa, to give Hassa. The same racial claims could be made more generally about the open emotional displays and thumping musical accompaniment of the charanga bands that are now a mainstay of the torcida, meaning to cheer or twist, supporters group like Galo Acura, Resistencia, Inferno, and Galo Metal that enliven Atletico's home and away matches today. As paying Black supporters began to be admitted into football matches in Brazil in the 1920s and 1930s, the conventional genteel discipline of crowd reactions, such crowd reactions as handkerchief waving and polite applause that had previously made these whites-only gatherings somewhat state affairs, slackened enough to make twisting and shouting an acceptable affective response to sport. Many of the players from an earlier generation were also able to learn some version of Hassa after Black footballers in the 1930s began to emulate the gamesmanship and rough and tumble European style of play that was being waged against them by whites. For the earliest Black footballers in Brazil, fighting back was a question of adapting or dying. And such was the success of their seeming, quote, assimilation, that we well might forget that their collective decision to no longer turn the other cheek had as much to do with a basic need for self-preservation as it did with Hassa. Reinaldo took care to remind me that Americans often don't enjoy games like futebol, which can end in a draw. We prefer to have a clear winner in our athletic contest, he said, and he's not wrong. But as a man who endured more abuse on the playing field than most, Reinaldo recognized as well that Hassa, whatever else it might mean, is a dignified means of keeping oneself and one's teams alive, remaining in a match no matter how unfavorable the sporting conditions might be. In this regard, Reinaldo can remember times when he would conserve his stores of Hassa during matches for those moments when he needed it most. Perhaps this was the mentality that the fans of Atletico were referring to when they released a YouTube video in 2013, chronicling their backs to the wall, come from behind success in the 2013 edition of South America's Copa Libertadores. With a nod to the United States' only Black president, Barack Obama, these Atleticanos let everyone know, yes, we can. Thank you. I'm happy to, yes. Okay, I think I understand.
So as you get asked the question, if you could just
repeat the question. I see. I can do this. Oh, yes, Vincent, please.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Nicely crafted. So is my recollection correct that this is a state also where some of the greatest musicians compose and stuff from?
So the question regards São Paulo, or Minas, the musical traditions of São Paulo or Minas Gerais? Okay. I would say nationally speaking, my understanding would be samba, like football, is something of a national signifier in that respect. But there is a more local musical tradition, the name of which escapes me. But it's closer akin to American version of country music than it is to samba. And it's actually enjoyed something of a renaissance in recent decades. But there are, in fact, some very well-known musicians from Minas Gerais state. And I actually had the opportunity to meet several of them who, not by coincidence, were Atlético Mineiro supporters. So there is a confluence there. And it's the two matches that I did attend, I can assure you that there was much musical accompaniment within the stands of involving percussions and drums and such.
So my question really is, some of the most famous musicians are from there. And did you perceive some connection between the musical traditions, which emphasize improvisation?
Yes, exactly.
And the sport traditions, which emphasize improvisation?
I would be inclined to say yes. And sort of to follow up on that question, the question again is the extent to which the kind of freedom and improvisation that informs musical expression would also inform sort of sporting athletic expression on the football pitch. I would be inclined to say yes. Gilberto Freire would certainly agree with you. But in making such a connection, one does begin to tread down the dangerous path again of making these kinds of essentializing claims about, because the musical association and the athletic association would not be far behind the kind of racial association that a racial minority would be more inclined to have a kind of playful, improvisational sort of relationship to the world than a more, quote, staid and sort of conservative white folk. Yeah, so I'd actually, the musicians I met would embrace and welcome that comparison. Academics would apply the pressure test to it, would be how I would say that, how would I respond. So thank you, it's a very compelling question. Anyone else in the room, or you can certainly take them from online. Eve, please.
Thank you for a great talk. It seems to me that this research is such a departure from previous work. We've done so much, but the work of yours that I'm familiar with is 19th century,
yes,
U.S. based. And so I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about any of the research or methodological challenges you experienced when you shifted gears to some really new and exciting topics.
Yeah, so the question concerns, rather flatteringly, sort of my own body of work, which is rooted in 19th century American literature and culture. And so my work on Brazilian football obviously would represent something of a leap for me. And it is that. And I'll also say, which I didn't do here because I was certainly trying to do too much already with this talk, but in kind of framing my book in the opening chapter, I actually addressed this question in a way because I think as much as the topics and subject of my research have been consistent from a certain point, something that's also been consistent with me is this methodological concern about what does the work that many of us do actually entail, and how does that work constitute a form of work and not a form of play. So I'm actually meditating on my own sort of work as a scholar in the opening sort of pages of this book as a way of framing my study of play. Because I'm not entirely convinced that my studying New England transcendentalists in the 19th century is any less a form of play than what's happening on a football pitch any given Saturday or Sunday. And I have this conversation with my students in my classes from time to time as we're sitting in a room talking about a novel or a short story. Are we playing or are we at work? So that's sort of the grander philosophical side of it. From a practical standpoint, I'm ashamed to say, logging so many hours over the years watching football and other sports, it occurred to me in the last few years that itself was a kind of preliminary research, a kind of grounding for my jumping into a focus on society and sport, for example. But it was a challenge, I won't lie to you. I mentioned to my colleague Kyle Coos before the talk that I certainly felt while I was conducting research for this project on site that I was playing journalist. But frankly, the people I was talking to and working with in Brazil didn't know me for my previous work and were flattered and excited that I was excited about the things that they were excited about. So they talked to me and they made it very easy for me, is how I would say. So I have to give a lot of credit to the people who were helping with this project, and there are many of them, sort of made it much easier than it would have been otherwise. But let's see what happens as I'm trying to get it published. So thank you, Eve. And please, Carolyn.
Thank you so much for that talk. I assume you are very familiar with your reviewers' assessment of the different kinds of knowledge that an expert has versus the person who has what's called a lovely French. I won't do it in French.
Oh, please do.
A feel for the game. Okay. He says that when you have a feel for the game, you know your knowledge is a really different kind of knowledge. And I'm wondering how your feel for the game changed when you stop being the kind of expert you have become after years of watching football on TV and loving it, clearly
right.
Loving it. There's obviously a lot of people become more part of it.
Yes,
right?
thank you.
How did your feel for the game change when you went on site? Okay. How did your feel for the game change?
That's wonderful. Thank you. So to relate that, the question invokes Pierre Bourdieu's notion of expertise as a prelude to asking a question about how my own sort of sense of expertise changed as I moved from being a purposeful fan to someone consciously and actively trying to sort of engage in a work of scholarship on this subject. Is that a fair assessment? Or how did my feelings about football change?
Yeah, just to.
I'll do that last. Is that fair? Okay.
Sure.
How did my feelings about football change?
How did your way of knowing?
How did my way of knowing change?
Feeling is a way of knowing.
Yes. Okay. There it is. How did?
When you play the game, right? You know the game differently from the person who watches the game from afar. And if you're playing the game by being like you have a role and go to Brazil,
right?
You're playing a journalist, you're playing the game, right?
I mean, ultimately, this is the whole project is an interrogation of my own feelings about football and the feelings we all have about feelings. And I think, not to be too simplistic, but as much as I love the game, and as strong as my feelings are for the game, being immersed with a group of people who have been culturally conditioned to maybe feel about it in a way that I can't, it humbled me, I'd have to say. As much as I love football, I think I came to decide that there's love and then there's love. And other people know a love and feel a love about football in particular that I probably can't ever know. And so I tried my level best and sort of record my struggles and my successes, I think, in this project, but there were both. And so my own shortcomings I think are part of what I'm meditating on in this project. So to be honest, I hope I answered that question. Okay.
So thank you. That was immensely interesting, especially after like hearing you talk, on the side about this project. To hear this is part of the project. So my question is about, you seem to emphasize in the beginning of your talk how you wanted to study play more humanistically, to kind of set aside, kind of a focus on making sport symbolically about social power and things like that. But I was kind of taken aback by how your meditation about race like really got into all these really kind of important changes in the ways in which racial identities and racial ideas were redefined across kind of the 20th century of Brazilian history. And I would imagine like those redefinitions are incredibly socially and politically important. So I guess, and the other thing I'm thinking about too is like you're doing this study where you're doing a study of like Brazilian soccer at the same time in which Bolsonaro, his supporters appropriate, kind of Brazil's iconic yellow national team jersey as a sign of, his support or, his administration. So like, how do you kind of square those kind of tensions within, this part of your project?
So the question essentially is calling me out. And no, but and you're exactly right. So the question involves the conceptual framing for my project, in which I do explicitly state that I'm trying to find a comparatively apolitical basis and justification for examining the humanistic and sort of subjective side of sport. And then I proceed to make an extended political argument or social analysis of sports significance in Minas Gerais. And this is something I frame the work, my project exactly the way I say here. And as I'm going along, I do conclude in the end that I tried and failed to do exactly what I said I was going to do at the outset. I don't know if it is possible, at least in Brazil. And certainly under the context of, the second part of the question was, under the recent political administration of Jair Bolsonaro's Conservative Party in Brazil. As you know, it's probably worth saying, Atletico their fan base still sees itself as the team of the people. And I was surrounded by folk at universities. And so, of course, the company I kept tended to hew somewhat left on the political spectrum. By and large, most professional footballers in Brazil, I don't want to overstate it, many professional footballers in Brazil are Bolsonaro supporters. They're well-to-do elites on a level that it's hard for us to match. They basically combine sports stars, screen stars, and rock stars, like the status of these people in this country. They occupy a different sphere, and they're not so much members of the common folk, even though they might play for the team that thinks it represents them. So that raised certain complications in conducting my research, because I was actually interviewing some players and former players and people close to the club during my time there. And with the conversation I had with Reinaldo in particular, someone who has a radical tradition and is even like many footballers actually had a short career in politics after he finished playing. The stipulation was, I'll talk to you if we don't talk politics. So I didn't get to talk about these issues explicitly with a lot of them though, but it would a few of them would start coming up, and they would just start kind of lecturing me on what's wrong with the world and how Bolsonaro was fixing it. And so yeah, it's inescapably political. It doesn't take long to figure that out when you're trying to talk about football. But at the same time though, there is more of a body of research, I would say, in Brazil than I've been able to encounter here, that of people willing to think about football and the feelings that we associate it with it. Not going exactly the same directions I'm going, but you're exactly right. I made a certain promise and I probably didn't keep it, but that's sort of part of my own kind of self-discovery in doing this work, is that what I envision being possible might not be. At least it proved so for me. But thank you for very astutely catching that. Okay. And I don't know if we're out of time now, but I do appreciate everyone sort of taking time and effort to listen to my work. So thank you.